of models, make sure you're familiar with all of them because certain ones are great for showing certain things, but others not so great, okay? So we have these little eyes, which for everything in the table that we're going to be covering, awesome. Okay, these are great for those. These ones, if you guys want to kind of take a note, these ones are great for everything except the choroid. It sucks for the choroid. But it has a lacrimal gland, which I'll cover again. But just want to know, this one's kind of like A+ on some, sucks on others. And then these models, where it's actually like an eye in the eye socket, you can see a lot of the parts on them, but we use these primarily for the lacrimal apparatus. Okay, so that'll be on the next page if you're looking at the table. But do make sure you get a glimpse of all of these and you kind of are familiar with what the structures of the eye look like on different ones, because since we have the models, it's fair game, okay? The model that I'm going to be showing you, though, on the board is going to be closest to this one. And then when I go over the lacrimal apparatus, I think it's actually this exact model that I found. So these are the two that I'm going to be showing you. I'm not going to be showing you any parts on these ones, so definitely make sure you're at least familiar with those models. All right, so we're going to start on page 4 with that table. Actually, one more note too, just as I'm thinking about it. If you look in that table with me on page 4, you'll see that there's, at the very right-hand side, a column that says function, and there are 4 functions filled in. For the ones that do not have a function by them, you don't need to go look it up, okay? So that means you don't need to know the function of the sclera. You do need to know the function of the retina. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, good. So the things that you will need to do as far as like on your own time homework type stuff, you'll notice that the manual has questions throughout it. It's kind of just like histology at the very beginning. You need to answer those questions, okay? But other than that, you're off the hook for the tables like this that have some functions filled in and not others. That's just kind of a formatting problem. All right, so again, we'll pick up with the sclera in this table. So can everyone see my pointer on the board okay? Right here? Just right here, okay. So the sclera is the white of the eye. So looking at this view, it's just the outermost layer. As the structures are listed in the manual, it's essentially going from most superficial and most anterior to most deep / most posterior. Just kind of like a general trend that you'll see when you go through these. So here you have the sclera. The next structure we have is the cornea, and the cornea is actually a continuation of the sclera. It's the same layer, but it's a modified layer because it's clear. So it's this portion here, it's the clear section on the most anterior part of the eye. So if we come down to this picture here, you can see again the sclera, and then the cornea is the see-through part. All right? Again, they're the same layer though. Now the choroid will be the next layer deep to the sclera, so this darker brown colored structure is the choroid. It's essentially like the nutrition body. It's a network of arteries and veins and a few other things. And again, you can see the choroid here with all of its veins and arteries drawn on. Now the most internal layer is the retina. So if we pull everything out of the middle, we can see the retina here. And in these funky models, just kind of to explain this to you, they don't really have like a choroid layer showing, they just have like a white film, okay? So when you look at these, you'll just see that it kind of looks like red with like a sheet of white painted over it. That's, the sheet of white is the retina, okay? So the choroid you can really only see on the border, you can't actually see it on the center of this model, okay? That's why I was saying it's not very good for the choroid. What you actually see there is that white film of the retina. Okay, so next, I'm actually going to skip over oris serrata and do ciliary body first, just because I think that order makes a little bit more sense. So what we have here is basically the anterior compartment of the eye. So you can see in these models that the front half of the choroid pops off. And that's what we have sitting face down here, is that front compartment. So it's basically this piece, okay? Now if you look at the back of that anterior compartment, we have this red smooth muscle structure here. It's essentially the back of the iris, okay? And that's called the ciliary body. And you'll see on our models that there's like, on this model you see there's little white specks. On some of our models there's like blue lines. It's all ciliary body. Okay, so this entire structure, white marks, red marks, it's all ciliary body. Now the ora serrata is this line right here where the ciliary body meets the retina. So if we put a series of stickers right along this line here, that's when we'd be asking for the ora serrata. Right, next we have the lens. The lens sits just posterior to the ciliary body. So right behind basically the iris, the ciliary body, you have this eclipse-shaped, in our models it's clear. As you'll see on Wednesday when we actually dissect the sheep's eye, it's kind of milky colored, so it's actually not that clear. But here we have this clear lens. If you were to see it in situ, when we have like an eye sitting up like this, you can see the lens just right here. Right, and now it's important to point out the lens here because that's going to be something we use in like 3 IDs to talk about something else, but I'll go in order for now. Alright, so next we have the iris. The iris is simply the color of your eye, so that's going to be indicated on the anterior portion, just right here. And the pupil is the hole in the middle of the iris. Okay, so the pupil isn't actually like a black hole in your eye or like a black spot in your eye. It's actually just an opening, right? And that's kind of how the ciliary body and the iris work together, because the iris will either expand or contract to let different measures of light in. And as we just learned, the lens sits right behind it, so the pupil is basically a hole that allows light through to hit the lens, right? And then the lens obviously is important for directing the light correctly against the retina so that you can actually form an image. Okay, so now we have the anterior and posterior cavities. The anterior and posterior cavities, here they're called compartments, but always remember to use what the manual says, not what other sources say. They refer to the space in front of or behind the lens. Okay? The reason that they have names is because they actually contain bodies of jelly-like fluid that are responsible for keeping the shape of your eye consistent. So have you guys heard of like glaucoma? That's a disease where the shape of your eye gets all jacked up because the fluid, and usually it's the posterior compartment, but the fluid in the area back here, or potentially up here, isn't correct. Okay, and that causes you to see really funky because this has to be like a perfect system in order to actually get that image to focus correctly on the retina. So the anterior compartment is the fluid-filled cavity in front of the lens. Oh, sorry, cavity, right? Not compartment. I keep saying compartment because I'm like reading the word on the screen, but it's cavity, not compartment. So anterior cavity, space in front of the lens. Posterior cavity, space behind the lens. Now, in our models, we actually have, as you can see here, a plastic piece that comes out of all of the models that represents the vitreous body. Okay, so it's called vitreous humor here. We call it the vitreous body. And that represents the fluid, or the gel-like substance, in the posterior portion of the eye. Okay? And it's actually really cool. This is like one of my favorite structures of the eye when we do the dissection, because it's seriously like jelly. And when you take it out, the lens always sticks to it, and it looks like an egg. It's so cool. So that's the vitreous body. And if we're going to be asking for the posterior and anterior cavities, we're most likely going to do it in a hypothetical scenario because they're cavities, they're spaces, right? So anytime we have a space like that that we can't really like put a sticker on, we're going to be asking for it hypothetically. Okay, so kind of note that. Especially like with the posterior cavity, since we actually have a structure in that space, we could put a sticker on the vitreous body and ask you to list the space